By the time the last overnight shift ended, several officers agreed on one thing they could not explain. The cell block had been empty, the doors locked, the lights steady. And yet something had moved through the tier without leaving a mark. No alarm tripped. No log recorded an entry. The sound did not belong to any inmate who could answer for it. Only later did administrators realize how often moments like this had been quietly written off. The place was Eastern State Penitentiary, rising from a residential neighborhood in Philadelphia. Long before it became a museum, it was one of the most famous prisons in the world, known for radical isolation and architectural control. The period that matters here is not its celebrated opening or its formal closure, but the decades in between, when the prison still functioned, deteriorated, and accumulated reports that staff could never fully reconcile. Those reports were not part of official policy. They appeared in oral accounts, in maintenance notes, in guard recollections given years later. They were not treated as evidence of anything supernatural. They were treated as problems with no solution. The earliest complaints were small. A door that opened without pressure. A light that flicked on in a sealed cell. Footsteps where no inmate was housed. Each incident had a possible explanation. Old wiring. Settling stone. Human error. But the pattern refused to stabilize. One of the most frequently mentioned locations was cell block 12, a tier that had been partially closed due to structural decay. It was officially off limits, yet officers assigned to nearby posts reported hearing voices during night rounds. Not shouting. Not conversation. Murmurs that stopped when approached. No inmate was ever found inside. What unsettled staff was not the sound itself, but its timing. The murmurs appeared during routine checks, not during storms, not during equipment failures. They followed the schedule. That raised the first quiet question. Why would random noise respect a prison timetable? Administrators responded the only way they could. They restricted access, reassigned patrols, and avoided documenting anything that could not be verified. The prison had a reputation to maintain. Rumors had consequences. But the reports continued. Maintenance crews working in the old death row area described cold zones that did not match airflow maps. Instruments showed normal readings. Workers felt otherwise. Several refused to continue alone after a steel gate reportedly slammed shut behind them, locking itself without mechanical engagement. When the gate was inspected later, nothing was wrong. That should have ended the matter. Instead, it spread it. Because the gate had no automatic system. By the mid-20th century, Eastern State was no longer the model institution it had once been. Overcrowding had replaced isolation. The original philosophy had collapsed under practical strain. Cells built for one held 2 or 3. Systems were patched, not replaced. The building aged faster than it was repaired. And as the infrastructure decayed, the stories intensified. Officers spoke of shadowy figures moving across the rotunda. Shapes without faces. Movement without sound. Always peripheral. Always gone when looked at directly. These accounts were consistent across shifts and years, but never simultaneous. No two people saw the same thing at the same time. That inconsistency was used to dismiss them. Then came the photographs. During the 1940s and 1950s, staff occasionally took informal photos inside restricted areas to document damage or overcrowding. In later years, when those images resurfaced, some appeared to show faint shapes or distortions. Light leaks. Double exposures. Chemical flaws. Every explanation was reasonable. Except for the one image taken in cell block 6. The photograph showed a corridor with a dark, elongated shape near a cell door. It did not resemble a person. It did not match known artifacts of the camera used. The original negative was reviewed. No alteration was found. The image was never released publicly during the prison's operation. That was the first major reveal. If stories like this matter to you, subscribe, because the next one goes even deeper. From that point forward, the accounts became harder to isolate. Staff transfers brought new people unfamiliar with the prison's reputation. Within months, many reported similar experiences without prompting. Doors that rattled only when certain cells were passed. A sudden pressure change inside sealed chambers. A sensation of being watched that ended the moment a threshold was crossed. Psychologists consulted by the state offered explanations grounded in stress, isolation, and expectation. Working inside a massive stone prison designed to suppress human contact could distort perception. That conclusion was officially accepted. But it did not address one detail. The experiences were not evenly distributed. Certain areas produced repeated reports. Others produced none. Cell blocks 4 and 12. The old infirmary. The execution corridor. Always the same places. Always the same descriptions. And always among people who had not been told what to expect. One retired guard later described how new officers were deliberately kept uninformed. Veterans wanted to see if the stories would emerge organically. They did. Within weeks, recruits began asking about the quiet spots. They used the same phrase without being coached. Why quiet, instead of loud? Because the silence itself changed. Several officers described moments where ambient noise dropped abruptly. No echo. No hum. Just absence. These episodes lasted seconds. Sometimes longer. Radios remained functional. Clocks kept time. Only the sound disappeared. No mechanical cause was identified. The prison continued operating into the early 1970s, despite mounting concerns about conditions and costs. As closure discussions began, inspections increased. Outside officials toured areas long sealed off. Some reported discomfort. Others reported nothing. One state inspector refused to enter cell block 12 a second time. He did not give a reason in his report. Off the record, he told colleagues that the air felt wrong. The phrase never appeared in documentation. As the population decreased, the building grew quieter. Empty cells amplified sound unpredictably. That should have reduced confusion. Instead, reports increased. With fewer inmates, there were fewer explanations. In one instance, a guard responding to a noise complaint followed footsteps from the rotunda into an empty wing. The steps continued ahead of him, maintaining distance. When he stopped, they stopped. When he resumed, they resumed. No one was found. No disciplinary action was taken. The guard requested reassignment. It was granted without comment. The question administrators could not answer was simple. Why now? Why would incidents escalate as the prison emptied? By the time Eastern State officially closed in 1971, the stories were no longer confined to staff. Contractors preparing the site for abandonment reported similar phenomena. Tools moved. Lights activated without power. Voices echoed in sealed spaces. These accounts were collected later, during preservation efforts, when the prison's past was being reevaluated. Historians were careful to distinguish record from recollection. No incident could be verified under controlled conditions. But the consistency persisted. Former inmates were interviewed decades later. Some described experiences during solitary confinement that mirrored staff reports. Whispering. Pressure. The sensation of presence. These accounts were treated cautiously. Isolation is known to affect perception. Yet again, the same locations were mentioned. That overlap complicated dismissal. The prison's design had been intended to break the will through silence and reflection. In practice, it produced extreme psychological stress. That much is documented. What is not documented is why certain architectural spaces seem to concentrate distress long after their intended function ended. Preservationists working in the 1990s attempted environmental mapping. Temperature variations. Airflow. Acoustic anomalies. Some irregularities were found. None explained the reports fully. Tour guides today often reference ghost stories, But those modern retellings are not the focus here. What matters is what occurred before the prison became a public site, when there was no incentive to exaggerate and no audience to impress. The people reporting these events were not seeking attention. They were seeking explanation. Many never found one. Skeptics argue that aging buildings create illusions. Stone expands and contracts. Sound travels unpredictably through long corridors. Human brains fill gaps under stress. All of that is true. But none of it explains why multiple individuals, across decades, described the same experiences in the same locations using the same language. Why certain cell blocks remained untouched by reports while others accumulated them. Why activity appeared to increase as human presence decreased. No official investigation ever concluded that Eastern State was haunted. No authority endorsed that interpretation. The prison closed for economic and humanitarian reasons, not paranormal ones. And yet, when the last gate was locked, many who had worked there expressed relief. Not because their jobs had ended, but because they no longer had to walk those corridors alone. Eastern State Penitentiary stands today as a historic site, its reputation shaped by both documented cruelty and undocumented experience. Its walls retain no answers. Only records of questions never resolved. What happened inside those cell blocks remains officially unexplained. And that unresolved space is where the stories continue to live. If this story kept you watching, the next one will stay with you even longer. Subscribe for more real prison documentaries.